Portland, Oregon, a city built between a river and a mountain range, famous for its rain, its bridges, its quiet residential streets lined with old trees. A city where most people go to work, come home, and sleep without incident. A city where, on an ordinary Wednesday evening in September 2006, something happened inside a small house that the rest of the country would spend years trying to understand. But before we get to that evening, we need to understand the woman at the center of it. Susan Kuhnhausen was an emergency room nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center, one of the city's major hospitals. She had spent her career in the ER, one of the most demanding environments in medicine. Emergency room nursing is not a job for the faint of heart. It requires physical strength because nurses move patients, lift people, hold struggling bodies still during procedures. It requires psychological endurance because the ER sees the worst that can happen to a human being, sometimes several times in a single shift. And it requires a particular kind of calm, the ability to assess a crisis, make fast decisions, and keep functioning when everything around you is falling apart. Susan had all of that. She was, by her own description, a big, strong woman. 5 feet 7 inches tall, over 200 pounds. She was experienced, capable, and tough in the way that people who work in emergency medicine for years become tough. Not reckless, not aggressive, but unafraid of hard things. At the time of the attack, Susan was in the middle of a painful chapter of her personal life. She and her husband, Michael James Kuhnhausen Sr., were estranged and moving toward divorce. The marriage had deteriorated. What Susan did not know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that her estranged husband had decided the divorce was a problem he intended to solve permanently. Michael James Kuhnhausen Sr. did not want a divorce, not because he wanted to save the marriage. The evidence that emerged during the investigation suggests the opposite, but because divorce, in practical terms, meant division of assets. It meant legal proceedings. It meant Susan would walk away with what the law said she was entitled to. To Michael Kuhnhausen, that was unacceptable. He made contact with a man named Edward Dalton Hafner. Hafner was a career criminal. Michael Kuhnhausen paid Edward Hafner $50,000. The job was simple: go to Susan's house and make sure she didn't survive. $50,000 to end a woman's life, to avoid a divorce settlement, to make a problem disappear. The transaction was not impulsive. It required planning, communication, and the deliberate decision to treat a human being as an obstacle to be removed. Investigators would later describe it as a cold-blooded, premeditated contract for murder. On the morning of September 6, 2006, Susan Kuhnhausen went to work. Her shift at Providence Portland Medical Center was ordinary. She cared for patients. She did her job. She had no idea that while she was at work, Edward Hafner had entered her home and was waiting for her to come back. He had a hammer. Susan came home from her shift in the early evening. She walked through her front door the way she had done hundreds of times before. Home, in her own space, in the house that was hers. Edward Hafner was inside. What happened next unfolded over approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes is a long time when you are fighting for your life. It is long enough for exhaustion to set in, for pain to register, for fear to become a physical thing pressing down on you. It is long enough to question whether you are going to survive. And it is long enough to decide over and over again that you are not going to stop. Hafner attacked Susan with the hammer. He struck her in the head. It was a blow intended to incapacitate her, to end the fight before it began. But Susan Kuhnhausen did not go down. She fought back. The struggle moved through the rooms of the house. Susan was injured. She was bleeding, and she kept fighting. She was not fighting the way people fight in films, with choreography and clean movements. She was fighting the way people fight when they understand that stopping means dying. With everything she had, using her size, her strength, her training, her refusal to surrender. Emergency room nurses know the human body. They know where strength comes from. They know how to endure. At some point during those 15 minutes, Susan managed to gain the upper hand. She pinned Edward Hafner to the floor. The words she said at that moment have been reported and confirmed across multiple sources. She looked at the man who had come to her home to kill her, and she said, "Tell me who sent you here and I will call you a fucking ambulance." It was not a theatrical line. It was a nurse talking. Someone trained to assess a medical situation. Someone who understood that a man on the floor, in the condition Hafner was in, needed medical intervention to survive. She was offering him a transaction, information for his life. Hafner did not take the offer. Edward Dalton Hafner died on the floor of Susan Kuhnhausen's home. She had strangled him with her bare hands. When it was over, Susan Kuhnhausen walked out of her front door, went to a neighbor's house, and called 911. Portland police responded to Susan's home on the evening of September 6th. What they found was the aftermath of a violent struggle. A dead man on the floor, a woman with a head wound, a house in disarray. The initial framing was straightforward, a home invasion that had gone wrong for the intruder. But investigators are trained to look past the surface, and the surface of this case, examined carefully, raised questions. Who was Edward Hafner? Why had he chosen this particular house? Was this random, an opportunistic break-in that turned violent? Or was it something else? The answers began to emerge as detectives dug into Hafner's background and his recent movements. Hafner was not a burglar. He was not someone who wandered into houses at random. He was a career criminal, and the evidence did not support the theory of a random attack. And then there was the money, $50,000 traced through the investigation back to its source, Michael James Kuhnhausen Sr., the estranged husband, the man in the middle of a divorce from the woman whose house had just become a crime scene, the man who stood to lose financially if Susan Kuhnhausen walked away from the marriage alive. Investigators built their case methodically. The payment, the connection between Michael and Hafner, the timing, the attack coming during an active divorce proceeding, the nature of Hafner's presence in the house. He was not there to steal. He was there to kill a specific person. He had a hammer. He had waited. This was not random. The picture that emerged was of a man who had decided that murder was preferable to divorce, that paying $50,000 to have his wife killed was a rational solution to a financial problem. It is a calculus so cold, so dehumanizing, that it is difficult to fully absorb. And yet it is not unprecedented. Investigators who work domestic homicide cases know that intimate partner violence does not always look like a moment of rage. Sometimes it looks like a plan. Michael James Kuhnhausen Sr. was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and solicitation of murder. Federal charges carrying serious sentences. The case against him was strong. The evidence of the payment, the connection to Hafner, the circumstances of the attack, prosecutors had built a solid record. Michael Kuhnhausen did not go to trial. In 2007, he entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. 10 years for arranging the murder of his wife. For paying a man $50,000 to go into her home with a hammer, for a plan that, had it succeeded, would have ended Susan's life and left her family without answers. Just a woman who didn't come home from work one day. The sentence was handed down. Michael Kuhnhausen went to prison, and Susan Kuhnhausen, who had survived the attack, continued her life. It is worth pausing here to consider what did not happen, what came within a hammer blow of happening. If Hafner's first strike had landed differently, if Susan had been smaller or less strong or less determined, if she had stopped fighting at any point in those 15 minutes, the plan would have worked. A man would have collected $50,000, and Michael Kuhnhausen would have waited for the investigation to wind down and gone on. Instead, the hitman died on the floor. After the case resolved, Susan Kuhnhausen did something that not everyone would have done. She talked about it. She gave interviews to newspapers and television programs, including a notable appearance on CBS's 48 Hours, which documented the case in detail. She appeared on the Oxygen Network's Snapped. She spoke to reporters from the Oregonian, the major daily newspaper in Portland, which had covered the case from the beginning. She was not seeking fame. The impression she gave in those interviews was of a woman who understood that her story had meaning beyond her own life, that what had happened to her was not just a crime story, but a case study in something larger. Susan spoke plainly about the attack. She described the struggle without dramatization. She talked about the moment she decided she was not going to stop fighting, and about the clarity that comes when the only two outcomes are survival or death. She described herself simply and accurately as a big, strong woman who refused to give up. She returned to nursing after the case was resolved, to the ER, to the work she had always done, to the patients who needed her. The story of Susan Kuhnhausen is extraordinary in its specific details. The 15-minute struggle, the death of the attacker, the discovery of the murder-for-hire plot, but it exists within a context that is not extraordinary at all. It exists within the context of intimate partner violence, which is one of the most common and most underreported categories of violent crime in the United States. The statistics are not abstractions. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 4 women in the United States will experience severe intimate partner physical violence during their lifetime. The National Domestic Violence Hotline reports that on an average day in America, more than 20,000 calls are made to domestic violence hotlines across the country. The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries tries to leave. Researchers who study intimate partner homicide have documented this pattern consistently. The period of separation, when a woman files for divorce, moves out, or otherwise signals that the relationship is ending, is when the risk of lethal violence is highest. Michael Kuhnhausen did not act in a moment of passion. He acted during a divorce proceeding. He acted because Susan was leaving. That is not a coincidence. It is a documented pattern. Murder for hire in domestic violence cases is not common, but it is documented. Law enforcement agencies across the country have investigated cases where an intimate partner, rather than committing violence directly, sought to arrange it through a third party. The act of hiring someone can feel to the person doing it like it provides some kind of buffer. It does not. Federal law treats solicitation of murder as seriously as the act itself, which is why Michael Kuhnhausen faced federal charges rather than simply a state-level investigation. Susan's case also became a reference point in conversations about self-defense, specifically about a woman's right and capacity to defend her own life against a physically threatening attacker. She was not a trained fighter. She was not armed with anything other than her own body and her own will. She used both. In September 2006, a woman came home from work to find a man waiting inside her house with a hammer and a contract on her life. She had been betrayed by the person who was supposed to be her partner, targeted not by a stranger, but by someone who had looked at her and decided she was worth more dead than alive. She fought for 15 minutes, injured, alone, against a man hired specifically to kill her. She won. The measure of what Susan Kuhnhausen did is not just physical. Yes, she was strong. Yes, she had the toughness that years of emergency nursing builds into a person, but strength alone does not explain 15 minutes. What explains 15 minutes is a decision, made and remade, over and over in the middle of fear and pain and exhaustion. Not to stop, not to give up, not to let the plan work. She walked out of that house, she called 911, she went back to her job, she told her story, and the man who paid to have her killed went to prison. Susan Kuhnhausen survived because she refused to stop.